The story begins inside a quiet corner of an old state prison. The walls were heavy with years of silence, the kind that never really leaves. Among hundreds of men who shouted, cursed, and argued through the days, there was one who rarely spoke. His name was Daniel Moore. Daniel had been there for more than 15 years. To the guards, he was known as the Quiet One. To the other inmates, he was the monk. He didn't fight, didn't gamble, and didn't get involved in anyone's business. Most days he could be found in the library, fixing broken pages or reading the same few books over and over. Sometimes he helped others write letters to their families. He had neat handwriting and a calm voice that made people listen. No one really knew much about him, and that was how he liked it. The prison was a rough place. Arguments could start over a missing spoon or a wrong look. Yet Daniel seemed to walk through all of it untouched, as if he lived in a different world inside his own mind. Even when a younger inmate once tried to pick a fight, Daniel didn't react. He just looked at the man for a moment, stepped aside, and went back to his cell. "He ain't got no fight left in him," someone said. The word stuck, because it was true. Daniel never fought back. Nobody talked about what he did to end up there. New inmates would ask, but the older ones told them not to. "He's been here longer than most of us," they'd say. If he wanted you to know, he'd tell you. So the mystery stayed. The truth was locked away, just like Daniel himself. Every evening when the yard went quiet and the lights dimmed, Daniel would sit on his bunk and stare at the small window. From there he could see a slice of sky, gray in the day, black at night, sometimes painted orange when the sun went down. That sky was the only thing that hadn't changed since he first came here. The years had taken everything else, his freedom, his friends, even the sound of his own laughter. But that patch of sky stayed the same. The chaplain often stopped by Daniel's cell. He was an older man with kind eyes who made his rounds through the cell block, checking on prisoners who seemed lost or broken. He liked Daniel but couldn't understand him. One day, as he handed Daniel a small Bible, he asked gently, "Do you believe in forgiveness?" Daniel didn't look up. "I believe in forgetting," he said quietly. The chaplain didn't press further. The guards had mixed opinions about him. Some respected his silence, others found it strange. One guard said he'd never seen Daniel raise his voice, not even when the food was cold or his cell flooded during a storm. "That man could sit through a fire and not move," the guard once told a new recruit. "Either he's made peace with something we don't know or he's hiding a whole lot of pain." There were rumors, of course. Some said Daniel used to be a teacher before his arrest. Others claimed he worked in a warehouse. One story said he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in a robbery that went bad. But the truth was buried under years of dust and forgotten paperwork. Even Daniel never corrected anyone. He just kept to himself. Life in prison followed a rhythm that never changed. Morning roll call, breakfast, work, yard time, dinner, and lockdown. Daniel moved through it like clockwork. The routine had become part of him. The only time he seemed truly alive was when he was helping someone write. A few inmates even called him Professor. He'd sit with them, listen to their words, and help them shape sentences they couldn't find on their own. In a place where most men were angry or scared, Daniel's calm was like quiet rain in a storm. But under that calm surface there was something else, a tiredness that went beyond the body. Sometimes at night, when the lights went out, Daniel would lie awake and listen to the sounds around him, the snores, the whispers, the echo of footsteps in the corridor. He thought about how many years had passed, how many seasons had changed without him seeing a tree or feeling rain. There were moments when he couldn't even remember what his own home smelled like. There was one person who still wrote to him, a woman named Ruth, the sister of his late mother. Her letters were short and gentle, filled with stories about the town where he grew up. She never asked questions about his case or what really happened. She just reminded him that she was still there. "The garden is blooming again," she once wrote. "If you were here, you'd be proud of how tall the sunflowers got." Daniel read that line more than 100 times. It reminded him that somewhere beyond those gray walls, life went on. Once a year, Daniel was called into a small room for a parole review. It was always the same. He sat on one side of the table. The officials sat on the other. They asked if he had anything to say about his case or his behavior. He always answered in a quiet voice, "No, sir." Then they would mark their papers and say he wasn't ready for release. Daniel never argued. He simply nodded and returned to his cell. The other inmates couldn't understand it. Man, at least try to fight for yourself, they'd tell him. But Daniel just said, fighting doesn't change what's already done. Still, there was something about him that made people curious. Even the chaplain couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's story wasn't what it seemed. Once after a sermon, the chaplain told another guard, "There's something off about that man's file. It's like pieces are missing." The guard shrugged. "That's old news," he said. "His case was closed years ago. Nobody cares about old paperwork." But Daniel cared even if he never showed it. Every now and then, when the memory hit him too hard, he'd sit in silence with his eyes closed, seeing flashes of the night that changed his life. The flashing lights, the shouting, the cold metal of the handcuffs. Then the courtroom, the judge's voice, and the sound of the cell door closing behind him. He tried to bury those images deep, but they never left completely. Over the years, Daniel saw many men come and go. Some were released and promised to write back, but none ever did. Others returned after getting caught again. The cycle never ended. Yet Daniel stayed. He didn't dream about freedom anymore. To him, freedom had become an idea that belonged to other people. One winter night during a lockdown, a small leak in the roof dripped cold water onto his bunk. The guard offered to move him to another cell, but Daniel refused. "It's fine," he said. "The sound helps me sleep." That was Daniel, always finding calm where others would complain. It was hard to tell whether he was strong or simply numb. In a place built to break people, Daniel had found a strange kind of peace. But peace built on silence can only last so long. The world outside might have forgotten him, but something inside those old files, the ones buried deep in the archives of the courthouse, was waiting to be found. And when it was, everything Daniel thought he had accepted would be shaken. For now, though, he sat under the dim light of his cell, reading a worn-out book with missing pages. The other inmates were asleep. The night was quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, a train passed, its faint whistle reaching through the dark. Daniel looked up at the small window again. The sky was the same as it had always been, silent, distant, and free. He closed the book and whispered to himself, not as a prayer but as a habit, "Maybe one day." Then he turned off the light and let the darkness take over. It started with a dusty box sitting on the corner of a table in a small legal aid office. The box was old, marked with faded writing and filled with forgotten files from past cases. Most people ignored it, but one person didn't. Her name was Maria Jenkins, a young intern who had just begun her first week working for a prisoner rights group. She was the kind of person who liked order and believed that every paper mattered. When she saw the box, she asked her supervisor what to do with it. He shrugged and said, "It's all old stuff. You can digitize it if you have time." So she did. For hours, Maria sat in that small office surrounded by piles of yellowed documents. Most were boring, reports from cases that had ended long ago. But then she found one that caught her eye. It was the file of a man named Daniel Moore. The folder was thinner than most, which struck her as odd. The front cover said he was serving time for armed robbery and assault. Nothing unusual about that, but inside something felt off. The police reports were incomplete, some pages were missing signatures, and a few witness statements had the exact same sentences repeated word for word. She frowned and whispered to herself, "That's strange." She read on. The confession in the file looked strange too. It was short and written in a style that didn't match Daniel's other documents. It didn't even have his full name signed at the bottom, just an X. It seemed careless, almost like someone was rushing. Most confessions were pages long and filled with details. This one looked more like a script. Maria leaned back in her chair. She wasn't a lawyer yet, but something about it didn't sit right with her. She made a note on her pad. Possible errors in statement? Missing reports? Later that afternoon, she walked into her supervisor's office holding the file. "Do you know this case?" she asked. The older man looked up from his laptop. "Daniel Moore?" I've heard the name. Been inside for decades, right?" He shrugged. "He never appealed. Guess he gave up." Maria nodded slowly. "Maybe," she said softly. "Or maybe he didn't have the chance." That night she stayed late. Everyone else had gone home, but Maria couldn't stop thinking about the file. She decided to check the state's public court records. When she searched Daniel's case, she noticed something strange again. Some documents were marked as unavailable. That usually meant they were missing or had never been scanned. She found the trial transcript but not the evidence list. That was unusual. The next day, she went to the courthouse archives. The clerk looked tired and unbothered when Maria asked to see the Moore case. "You're going way back," he said. "That one's from the 90s. He disappeared behind a door and returned with 2 boxes. Maria opened them carefully. Inside were stacks of papers, old photographs, and worn-out folders. As she flipped through them, her eyes widened. There it was, the fingerprint report. It was dated months after Daniel's trial, and said that none of his prints matched the weapon found at the crime scene. The report was stamped filed but had no record of ever being used in court. She stared at it for a long time. "How could this not have been shown?" she whispered. She made copies of everything and returned to the office. Her heart was racing. She didn't know what to do next, but she knew she couldn't just leave it alone. She showed the documents to her supervisor, who frowned and rubbed his chin. "That's serious," he said. "But after all these years, it's hard to reopen a case without solid proof." Maria didn't back down. "This is solid proof," she said. "It's a fingerprint report that clears him." Her supervisor sighed. "You've got good instincts, Maria, but you need more than that." Maybe the court overlooked it. Maybe his lawyer dropped the ball. "You can write a summary and file it with our review team." That was the polite way of saying, "Don't get your hopes up." But Maria couldn't let it go. She stayed awake that night thinking about Daniel Moore. She imagined him sitting somewhere in a small cell, living each day as if justice had already been decided. The thought made her uneasy. She had read about wrongful convictions before, but now it felt real, like a story she had accidentally stepped into. Over the next few days, she dug deeper. She requested old news articles about the case. The headlines were simple: "Local man convicted in store robbery." There was a photo of Daniel being led away in handcuffs. He looked young, almost confused, not angry. There was no mention of any solid evidence, just that a witness claimed to have seen someone matching his description. Maria shook her head. A matching description wasn't proof. It was a guess. She began piecing the story together like a puzzle. The robbery happened at a small convenience store one night. The clerk was injured and the robber fled. A few days later, Daniel was arrested after someone said he looked like the suspect. The weapon, a rusty handgun, was found behind a dumpster near his apartment. The prints didn't match, but by then the police had already built their case. The confession sealed it. The more Maria read, the more she realized how weak the evidence had been. There were no eyewitnesses who could clearly identify him. No fingerprints, no physical proof. Just words on paper and a confession that looked suspicious. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like convenience. Maria told herself she was probably overreacting, but something in her heart said otherwise. She decided to find Daniel. She called the corrections department and asked for permission to visit him. The officer on the phone sounded surprised. "Nobody's visited that man in years," he said. "You sure you got the right name?" Maria said yes. A week later, she stood in the waiting room of the prison holding her visitor pass. The air smelled of metal and disinfectant. She felt nervous. What if he didn't want to talk? What if she was wrong? But as soon as she walked through the gates and saw him sitting on the other side of the glass, all her doubts faded. He looked calm, older than his file photo, with eyes that had seen too many years. When she introduced herself and explained why she came, he didn't react at first. He just looked at her quietly. Then he said, "You found my file?" She nodded. "I did, and I think something was wrong with it." For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he gave a small, tired smile. "You're the first person to say that in 20 years, he said softly. "But it doesn't matter anymore." Maria leaned forward. "It does matter," she said. "There's a report showing your fingerprints weren't on the weapon. Did you know about it?" His eyes flickered with surprise, but he shook his head. "No," he said. "My lawyer never showed me that. They told me it wouldn't help." She could see the pain behind his calm expression. He had stopped believing anyone cared. But now, for the first time in a long while, someone was listening. The conversation lasted only half an hour, but it changed both of them. When the guard came to escort him away, Daniel looked back at her through the glass. "You shouldn't waste your time on old ghosts," he said quietly. But Maria only replied, "Maybe some ghosts deserve a second look." As she walked out of the prison, the wind felt colder than before. She knew what she had to do. There were too many missing pieces in Daniel's story, and she wasn't going to stop until she found them. That night, Maria opened her notebook and began writing everything she had discovered. Page after page filled with notes, questions, and copies of old reports. It was late when she finally closed the file. Outside her window, the city was quiet, the same kind of silence that had surrounded Daniel for years. But now that silence had been broken. The truth was still buried, but for the first time in decades, someone had started digging. Daniel sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the small window that showed only a slice of sky. It was early morning, and the sun had not yet reached the prison walls. He was still thinking about the young woman who had come to see him a few days earlier, Maria. The way she looked at him, with quiet determination, had stayed with him. People didn't usually look at him like that. Most saw a convict, a man whose story was already written, but she looked at him like his story wasn't over yet. For years, Daniel had avoided thinking about the past. It was easier that way. In prison, memories could hurt more than hunger or cold nights. But after Maria's visit, the memories came back. The day of his arrest, the long hours in the interrogation room, the hopeless feeling in court. It all returned, sharper than before. He tried to push it away, but he couldn't. A few days later, Maria came again. This time she was allowed to sit across from him at a small table in a quiet room. There was no glass between them, only the watchful eyes of a guard nearby. She placed a folder on the table and smiled gently. "I found more," she said. Daniel nodded but didn't reach for it. "You don't have to show me," he said softly. "I already know what they wrote." Maria shook her head. "You might not know all of it." She opened the folder and showed him the old fingerprint report. He looked at it for a long moment, tracing the faded lines with his eyes. "This was never in court," she said. "If it had been, things could have been different." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands folded. "Different?" he repeated. "I used to believe that word meant something." Maria didn't speak. She could see the weight in his eyes, the kind that came from years of carrying silence. After a pause, he said quietly, "You want to know why I never fought back?" She nodded. Daniel took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was slow at first, as if he hadn't used it in years. "It happened a long time ago," he said. "I was working at a repair shop back then. It wasn't much, but it was honest work. I kept to myself, lived in a small apartment, didn't bother anyone. Then one night I was walking home when a police car stopped me. They said I matched the description of a man who had robbed a store nearby." He paused and looked down at his hands. "I told them they were wrong, but they didn't care. They put me in the car and took me to the station. They questioned me all night, same questions over and over. I kept saying I didn't do it. After a while, I stopped talking. That's when one of them slid a paper across the table. They said if I just signed it, I could go home." He gave a faint, bitter smile. "I was tired, hungry, scared. I didn't even read it. I just wanted it to be over. So I signed it." Maria listened quietly, her eyes fixed on him. "That was your confession?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "That was the paper that sent me here." His voice trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. "At the trial, my lawyer said not to worry. He said the truth would come out. But when the jury came back, they didn't look at me once. The judge said words I still remember. 'You have been found guilty.' And that was it. The door closed and my life ended right there." The room fell silent for a moment. Maria could hear the faint sound of keys jangling down the hall. Daniel leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "You asked why I didn't fight back. At first I tried. I wrote letters. To lawyers, to reporters, to anyone I thought might listen. Most never answered. A few sent short replies saying there was nothing they could do. After a while, I stopped writing. I stopped hoping. When you fight for years and no one hears you, you start to believe your voice doesn't matter." Maria's throat felt tight. She had read about wrongful convictions, but hearing it from him made it real. "You never had anyone to help you?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "My mother tried for a while. She believed me, but she passed away a few years after I got locked up. After that, I didn't have anyone left." He looked at her carefully. "You're the first person to ask me what really happened. Everyone else already decided." Maria felt her chest tighten. "I believe you," she said softly. "And I think we can prove it." But Daniel didn't seem convinced. "Prove it to who?" he said. The world moved on. Nobody remembers what happened that night but me. She hesitated, then said, "That's not true. I've been digging into the case. There are gaps in the police reports, missing pages. Some of the witness statements look copied. It's like they were written to fit a story that was already made up. Daniel looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I used to think someone would find the truth. Maybe that someone was always supposed to be you." He didn't say it as a compliment, it was more like a realization, as if fate had been waiting for her to show up all along. After that day, Maria started visiting regularly. Each time Daniel told her a little more. He spoke about the day of the robbery, the noise, the confusion, the flashing lights of police cars that came out of nowhere. He had been on his way home carrying a bag of tools. That's what made them stop him. "They said the robber had a bag," he said with a shrug. "I told them it was for work, but they didn't care." Maria took notes every time he spoke, her pages filling with details no one had bothered to ask before. Every piece of his story matched the inconsistencies she had seen in the old files. It made her angry that a man could lose his life because someone didn't do their job right. One afternoon, as she was packing up her papers, Daniel asked her a question that stopped her in her tracks. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "You could be working on any case. Why mine?" Maria looked up from her notes. "Because you didn't give up completely," she said. "You may have stopped fighting, but you never stopped living. That means there's still a part of you that wants the truth." Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe," he said. "But sometimes the truth comes too late." Maria shook her head. "Not if we find it." When she left that day, Daniel sat alone for a long time. He thought about what she said. For the first time in years, he let himself imagine what life outside those walls might feel like. Not freedom, he didn't dare dream that far, but maybe peace. Real peace, the kind that didn't come from silence. The next morning, he wrote a letter. It was the first one he had written in over 10 years. He wrote to Maria, thanking her for listening, for believing, for caring when no one else did. The letter was short, but every word was honest. When she received it, she kept it folded in her bag as a reminder of why she started all this. From that point on, something changed between them. Daniel began to open up more, and Maria began to see the man behind the prison uniform. Not just a case number, but a person who had been forgotten. Every visit, she left more determined to uncover the truth. And Daniel, though still cautious, began to feel a small spark of hope, one he thought had died long ago. He still sat by his window at night, staring at the same piece of sky. But now it looked a little different. Somewhere beyond that small square of light, there was someone fighting for him, someone who believed his voice mattered. For the first time in 20 years, Daniel whispered to himself, "Maybe this isn't the end after all." Maria sat at her small desk, surrounded by papers that covered every inch of the surface. There were photocopies of old police reports, trial transcripts, and notes written in her quick, looping handwriting. The air smelled like old paper and coffee. It had been weeks since she first met Daniel, and every time she looked at his file, something inside her told her there was more to uncover. Her mentor, an older lawyer named Richard, walked into the office holding a cup of tea. He had spent decades working on cases like this, but his patience was worn thin from years of disappointment. "You're still on that case?" he asked. Maria didn't look up. "Yes," she said. "I found more inconsistencies. The police report and the witness statement don't line up." He sighed, setting his tea on the desk. "Maria, I admire your determination, but reopening a case this old isn't simple. We'd need new evidence, something the court can't ignore." Maria pushed a paper toward him. "This is new evidence," she said. "The fingerprint report was never submitted. It proves he wasn't the one holding the weapon." Richard studied it for a moment. "You're right. That should have been presented. But without proof that it was intentionally hidden, the court might call it a clerical mistake." Maria crossed her arms. "A mistake that cost a man his life." He nodded slowly. "All right. Let's do this the right way. We'll request an appeal review, but we need to be careful. Cases like this can stir up trouble. You have to be ready for resistance." Maria looked at him, her expression steady. "I already am." The next few weeks were long and exhausting. Maria and Richard gathered every piece of paper, every witness name, every date that could help. They worked late into the night, the office lights glowing long after everyone else had gone home. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle, a missing report here, a signature that didn't match there. The deeper they looked, the more the story started to fall apart. They found the name of the detective who had led the investigation years ago, a man who had since retired. Maria tracked him down to a quiet neighborhood outside the city. When she knocked on his door, he looked surprised to see her. "You must be lost," he said, half smiling. Maria held out her card. "I'm not lost. I'm here about a case you handled a long time ago. Daniel Moore." The smile faded from his face. "I don't talk about old cases," he said, starting to close the door. But Maria stepped forward slightly. "A man's been in prison for 20 years for something he might not have done. Please, sir, I just need to ask a few questions." He hesitated, then sighed. "I don't remember much," he muttered. "It was a long time ago." She handed him a copy of the fingerprint report. He glanced at it and frowned. "I never saw this," he said. "This wasn't in the file when we went to trial." Maria's heart pounded. "You're sure?" He nodded, positive. "If that report had come across my desk, I would have mentioned it." She left his house with her mind racing. Someone had deliberately left that report out. Someone had made sure Daniel never had a fair chance. Back at the office, Richard listened as she told him everything. "If we can prove that," he said, "we might have grounds for a full retrial." But it wouldn't be easy. They would need to convince the district attorney's office to review the evidence, and that meant stepping into a world of politics and pride. "These people don't like to admit mistakes," Richard warned. "They'll fight to protect their record." Maria nodded. "Then we'll fight harder." They filed the appeal, attaching every piece of evidence they had uncovered. Weeks passed with no response. Maria checked her email constantly, her stomach twisting every time she saw nothing new. Finally, a letter arrived from the district attorney's office. The request had been denied. The reason? Insufficient new evidence to justify reopening the case. Maria felt her heart sink. She stared at the paper, reading the words over and over. Richard put a hand on her shoulder. "This happens," he said softly. "Don't take it personally." But she couldn't let it go. "They didn't even look at the report," she said. "They just don't want to admit they were wrong." That night, Maria sat alone at her desk again, the office empty around her. She picked up Daniel's letter, the one he had written weeks before. It was short, but one line stood out. "I stopped fighting because I thought no one cared. Don't let that be true." She read it several times, then made up her mind. If the system wouldn't listen, maybe the public would. She reached out to a local journalist who had written stories about wrongful convictions before. His name was Tom, and he had a reputation for digging deep. They met at a small diner where Maria laid out the documents across the table. "You're saying the police hid a report that cleared this man?" Tom asked, flipping through the papers. "Yes," Maria said. "And nobody ever brought it up." "Not once." He leaned back in his seat. "If what you're saying is true, this could be a big story." A week later, the story hit the news. Old records reveal possible wrongful conviction in decades-old case. It spread faster than Maria expected. Other news outlets picked it up, and soon people were talking. Calls came into the office, some from supporters, others from officials demanding answers. The pressure grew so strong that the district attorney's office finally agreed to reopen the review. Inside the prison, Daniel heard about it from another inmate who had seen the news on the TV in the common room. "Hey, that's you," the man said, pointing at the screen. Daniel didn't know whether to believe it. After so many years of silence, hearing his own name on television felt unreal. When Maria came to see him, he asked, "Did you really do it?" She smiled. "Yes, the case is being looked at again. They can't ignore it now." For the first time, Daniel laughed. It was quiet and short, but it was real. "I don't know what to say," he said. "Say you haven't given up yet," Maria replied. Over the next few months, the case became a topic of public debate. People demanded answers. Why had the fingerprint report been hidden? Why had the confession been accepted without proof? The pressure mounted until a court date was finally set to review the evidence. Maria and Richard worked tirelessly, preparing every document, every statement, every question they would need. The day of the hearing arrived. Daniel was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs, wearing a clean shirt for the first time in years. He looked around slowly, taking in the faces, the judge, the reporters, the crowd that had gathered. Maria sat beside him, her files neatly stacked. When the judge asked if they were ready, Richard stood. "Your Honor," he said, "we are here today to show that a mistake was made, a mistake that took 20 years of an innocent man's life." As the hearing began, Maria watched Daniel from the corner of her eye. His hands trembled slightly, but his face stayed calm. It was the same quiet strength he had carried all these years. And as the evidence was presented piece by piece, Maria felt something shift in the room. The truth was no longer buried. It was finally being spoken aloud. Outside the courthouse, people held signs that read, "Justice for Daniel Moore." Cameras flashed as reporters tried to get statements. For the first time, the world was listening to a story that had been silent for too long. The fight wasn't over yet. But for Daniel and Maria, it felt like the beginning of something new. The moment when hope finally stepped back into the light. The courtroom was quiet when everyone returned from the break. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting to hear what would happen next. Daniel sat beside Maria and Richard, his hands folded on the table. He didn't look like the same man who had walked into prison all those years ago. The weight of time was still in his eyes, but there was something else now, a small, fragile kind of hope. Maria glanced at him and whispered, "We're almost there. Just stay calm." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the judge's bench. The district attorney stood across the room, flipping through notes with a look that tried to hide discomfort. The story had become public now, and no one wanted to be the one responsible for a mistake this big. When the judge returned to his seat, everyone stood. The sound of chairs sliding echoed through the room. The judge adjusted his glasses and spoke clearly. "You may be seated." He looked down at the file before him, a thick folder filled with years of paperwork, old evidence and new reports that Maria had fought to bring forward. Richard rose to speak. His voice was calm but carried a quiet fire. "Your Honor," he began, "this case has stood for over 20 years as a conviction based on incomplete and misleading evidence. We now know that a critical fingerprint report was hidden during the original trial, a report that clearly excluded Mr. Moore from the weapon used in the robbery. We're not here to rewrite history, we're here to correct it." The district attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the new material, it is important to remember that the jury at the time reached their verdict based on what was presented in court. Procedures must be respected." Maria stood before he could finish. "Respectfully, Your Honor, how can we talk about procedures when the system itself broke them first? A report that could have cleared an innocent man was buried. That isn't a procedure, it's a betrayal," the courtroom murmured. The judge raised a hand to quiet the room. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. He looked back at the papers, flipping through slowly. "This report," he said, "was verified by the state lab?" "Yes, Your Honor," Maria replied. "We obtained confirmation directly from the archives." The judge nodded and leaned back. The silence stretched for several minutes, broken only by the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Then he looked up at Daniel. "Mr. Moore, you have served 20 years in prison for this conviction. Do you wish to say anything before I give my decision?" Daniel hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't planned to speak, but the moment felt larger than anything he could have prepared for. He stood, his voice low but steady. "Your Honor, I spent years trying to understand why this happened. I lost everything, my family, my home, my life. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe the truth would come out on its own. But it didn't. It took someone else believing in me for the first time in decades." He looked toward Maria. "I don't want revenge. I just want my name back." The room was silent again. Even the district attorney looked down at his papers, unsure what to do with his hands. The judge took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented," he said slowly. "The failure to include the fingerprint report in the original trial represents a serious violation of due process. This court finds sufficient cause to vacate the conviction of Daniel Moore." He paused, then looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Moore, you are hereby declared a free man." The words hung in the air for a second before they sank in. Maria covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Richard let out a long breath he didn't realize he was holding. Daniel didn't move at first. He just stared at the judge as if afraid to believe it. Then the guard beside him stepped forward and unlocked the handcuffs. The sound of metal clicking open echoed in the courtroom, a sound Daniel would never forget. Reporters outside caught the moment the doors opened. Flashing lights and shouts filled the air, but Daniel barely heard them. He walked slowly down the courthouse steps, the sunlight touching his face for the first time as a free man. Maria was beside him, holding a folder against her chest, her expression full of emotion. It's over, she whispered. He looked at her, his voice quiet. No, he said. It's just beginning. They stood there for a while, surrounded by noise and chaos, yet it all felt distant. For Daniel, everything looked new. The sky, the streets, even the wind. After so many years behind bars, the world felt bigger than he remembered. A reporter called out, asking how it felt to be free. Daniel smiled faintly. It feels like I can breathe again, he said. The next few days were a blur. News outlets ran stories about the case, interviews, and headlines that called it a historic correction. People debated online about justice and forgiveness. But for Daniel, none of that mattered as much as the small things. Walking without a guard watching him. Tasting food that wasn't served on a tray. Hearing the sound of rain on a roof instead of concrete walls. Maria helped him find a temporary place to stay. It was a small apartment near the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it was quiet. When she dropped him off, she handed him a small envelope. These are some documents, she said. Your release papers, your identification, and a contact for someone who helps people rebuild after wrongful convictions. They can help you get started. Daniel looked at her and smiled softly. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You already did, she replied. By not giving up. For a few seconds, they just stood there in silence. Then Maria said, You know, people will want to hear your story. Maybe it can help others. Daniel thought for a moment, then nodded. Maybe one day. Right now, I just want to remember what freedom feels like. That night, Daniel sat by the window of his small room, looking out at the city lights. Cars moved along the street. People walked by laughing, carrying grocery bags, talking on phones. It was ordinary, but to him it was beautiful. He thought about his mother, about how she never stopped believing in him even when everyone else did. He wished she could see this moment. The next morning, he took a walk to a nearby park. The air was cool and smelled of grass. Children ran around, people fed pigeons, and somewhere a musician played a slow tune on a guitar. Daniel sat on a bench, feeling the sun warm his skin. For a long time, he just watched life happen around him. He didn't need to speak. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of a cell, but of peace. Later that week, Maria came to visit. She had news. The police department is reopening several old cases, she said. They want to find out how many reports like yours were mishandled. Daniel nodded. That's good, he said. No one should go through what I did. Maria looked at him for a moment. Would you be willing to talk to them? Share your experience. He hesitated, then smiled. If it can help someone else, yes. Months passed, and Daniel slowly started to rebuild. He began volunteering at a community center, helping young people who were struggling to stay out of trouble. He didn't talk much about his past, but those who knew could see how deeply he cared. Sometimes he would look out the window and smile quietly, as if reminding himself that he was really there, living, breathing, free. Maria kept in touch, visiting when she could. They would sit on that same park bench and talk, not about the case anymore, but about life. She once asked him, Do you ever think about what could have been? Daniel thought for a long time before answering. No, he said softly. I think about what is, and right now that's enough. As the sun set behind the trees, he looked around, the laughter of children, the soft wind, the distant hum of the city, and felt something deep in his chest. It wasn't anger or sadness or even relief. It was peace. The kind of peace that only comes after years of darkness. For the first time in his life, Daniel didn't feel like a prisoner anymore. He felt like a man who had finally found his way home,